Welcome back, everybody. It's August 4th, 2026, and Iran just claimed it destroyed 3 American F-35s in a single strike. And then everything that happened next made the claim almost more interesting than the strike itself. 3 stealth fighters, gone. 3 more, heavily damaged. American officers and maintenance crews, dead, according to Tehran. And within hours, the United States military stood up and said none of it happened. Not one aircraft, not one casualty. So somebody is lying, or somebody is confused, or maybe both sides are telling a version of the truth that only makes sense from where they're standing. Stick around, because we're going to break down exactly what Iran said, exactly what America said back, what a ballistic missile can and cannot actually do to a 5th-generation stealth fighter sitting in a hardened shelter. And then we're going to get into the part of this story that barely anybody is talking about, which is why this claim matters, even if it's completely false. So let's set the scene. On the 30th of July, 2026, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps put out a statement through Tasnim News and IRIB, their state broadcaster, claiming that their aerospace force had launched a retaliatory ballistic missile strike on Muwaffaq Salti Air Base in Jordan, which most of the world knows by its older name, Al-Azraq Air Base. According to the IRGC, several ballistic missiles slammed into the deployment ramp and the maintenance hangar where American F-35 fighter jets were being housed. Their claim, word for word in spirit, if not in exact phrasing, it was that 3 F-35s were completely destroyed and 3 more were heavily damaged. And they didn't stop there. They also said several American officers and technical and maintenance personnel were killed in the strike. Now, here's the part that gives you the motive. The IRGC framed this entire attack as a response to an earlier American strike that hit 2 residential homes on Iran's Qeshm Island, an island sitting right at the mouth of the Strait of Hormuz, injuring at least 2 people. So in Tehran's telling, this is retaliation, an eye for an eye. They hit our homes, we hit your jets. Within hours, the United States Central Command, CENTCOM, the folks who run the entire American military footprint across the Middle East, came out swinging on social media. And I mean swinging. They didn't just deny the F-35 claim, they went after multiple Iranian claims in the same post. First claim they addressed was Iran's repeated assertion that the Strait of Hormuz remains dangerous for commercial vessels because of American operations. CENTCOM's response to that was basically, the only danger to commercial vessels in the Strait is the IRGC's own verbal threats and attempted attacks. Then they got to the F-35 claim directly and said, quote, "No U.S. aircraft were destroyed or damaged in recent attempted Iranian attacks. All missiles and drones were intercepted or failed to reach targeted areas. Clean, flat, total denial." And notably, the U.S. military did not immediately respond to the specific claim about American service member deaths, which, if you're paying attention, is the kind of silence that gets people talking. Now, Jordan's own military, separately from anything the Americans said, confirmed that its air defenses intercepted and shot down 5 missiles launched from Iranian territory toward the kingdom early that same morning. A Jordanian military spokesperson said air defenses engaged 5 missiles targeting the kingdom's territory and that they were detected, intercepted, and shot down according to established defense plans. And this wasn't a one-off. Jordan had been reporting interceptions for 4 consecutive days at that point. 5 missiles on the Wednesday, 1 drone on the Tuesday, 2 drones on the Monday before that. So we know for a fact that missiles were fired at Jordan. We know Jordan says it intercepted them. What we don't have independent confirmation of is what Iran claims happened after some of those missiles supposedly got through. And this is where things get messy in the best way for content like this, because now you've got satellite imagery entering the chat. Low-resolution satellite images started circulating on social media and among open-source intelligence accounts, showing what some analysts described as possible damage to hangars or other structures at the base. But, and this is a big but, analysts who looked closely said the images were simply too limited in resolution to determine whether any aircraft were actually destroyed, or frankly, whether F-35s were even inside those specific buildings at the time. Iran, sensing that CENTCOM's flat denial was gaining traction in Western media, decided to up the ante. They released their own photographs, which they said showed clear damage to hangars at Al-Azraq. The Tasnim News Agency published a piece specifically framed around challenging CENTCOM's denial, essentially daring the world to look at the pictures and decide for themselves. But here's the problem for Tehran. Independent organizations still have not verified those images, and American officials continue to dispute Iran's interpretation of what those images actually show. A damaged hangar wall is not the same thing as 3 destroyed F-35s. You can blow a hole in a building and still have every aircraft inside walk away untouched, or you can have nothing inside at all. So now you've got a classic fog of war situation, and honestly, this is not new territory for this specific conflict. Go back to March of 2026, and you'll find the first real seed of this entire narrative. On the 19th of March, an Air Force F-35A Lightning II was flying a combat mission over Iranian territory when it took a hit, reportedly from ground fire, quite possibly a shoulder-fired missile, given the total absence of any radar warning beforehand. Captain Tim Hawkins, the CENTCOM spokesperson, confirmed publicly that the aircraft landed safely and the pilot was in stable condition. That was the first time in history a stealth fighter had reportedly been struck by enemy fire and still made it home. Iran's state media ran with that moment hard. Releasing video they claimed showed their air defense systems hitting the jet. And ever since that day, the psychological framing has been locked in. Iran wants the world, and more importantly, wants its own population, to believe that American stealth technology is not untouchable, that the emperor has no clothes. That's the entire narrative arc that leads directly to this claim about 3 destroyed F-35s at Al-Azraq. Let's actually talk about whether this is even physically plausible, because that's where the real analysis has to happen. A ballistic missile, especially the kind Iran has been firing throughout this conflict, things like the Zulfiqar and the Qadr, which were literally put on display at Azadi Square in Tehran as a show of strength, these are not precision-guided cruise missiles with pinpoint terminal accuracy against a single parked aircraft. They're area weapons. They're circular error probable, meaning the radius within which the missile is statistically likely to land can range from tens of meters to, depending on the specific variant and whether it's using any kind of terminal guidance update, potentially much wider. Now, if you land a warhead close enough to a hardened aircraft shelter, sure, you can absolutely cause damage. Shrapnel, blast overpressure, secondary fires from fuel or munitions stored nearby. All of that is real, and all of that has happened in this war already. But completely destroying 3 F-35s and heavily damaging 3 more in a single strike would require either an extraordinarily lucky hit directly on an unprotected flight line with jets sitting out in the open, or multiple missiles landing with a level of accuracy that Iran's ballistic missile force has not consistently demonstrated throughout this conflict. And that's actually the crux of the skepticism from Western analysts. It's not that Iran can't hit Jordan. It's that hitting Jordan and precisely destroying 3 specific 5th-generation aircraft inside a maintenance facility are 2 very different levels of capability. Let's also talk about why the F-35 specifically has become the obsession here, because Iran isn't randomly picking an airframe to claim victories against. The F-35 is the most advanced fighter jet operating in that theater, and taking 1 down, or even convincingly claiming to take 3 down, is a propaganda jackpot unlike almost anything else in the American arsenal. Think about it from Tehran's side for a second. You can claim you shot down 20 drones and nobody outside the region blinks. You claim you destroyed 3 F-35s, and suddenly you're trending globally, you're forcing the most powerful air force on Earth to issue a formal public denial, and you're handing your own population a story of resistance and defiance against what they've been told for years is an unbeatable enemy. That's not a battlefield objective anymore. That's an information objective, and Iran has been running this play since the March incident with remarkable consistency. Throughout this conflict, the IRGC has repeatedly claimed to have destroyed or damaged American aircraft and other high-value assets sitting at bases across Jordan, Kuwait, Bahrain, and other locations hosting U.S. forces. Claims in June and again in mid-July described the destruction of fighter hangars and multiple aircraft at this exact same Al-Azraq base, often delivered with the same confident, assertive language you're hearing now. So when you zoom out, this isn't the first time Iran has said this about this specific base. It's becoming almost a pattern, a recurring chapter in the same story, repeated roughly once a month whenever Tehran needs a win to hand its own people. Now go and think about the timing of this specific claim, because timing tells you almost as much as the content does. This strike on Al-Azraq didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened hours after the United States conducted a strike on Qeshm Island that Iran says hit 2 residential homes and injured civilians. CENTCOM's characterization of that operation was different, describing it as strikes against IRGC-related targets rather than residential structures. So you've got 2 completely different stories about the exact same event, mirrored by 2 completely different stories about the counterstrike that followed it. This is the entire information war in miniature. Nobody agrees on what happened at Qeshm, nobody agrees on what happened at Al-Azraq, and both sides are using their version of events to justify the next escalation. And speaking of escalation, this is where you have to understand what was happening at the highest levels of the American military at the exact same time this claim was being made, because it puts everything into a much bigger frame. According to reporting that surfaced around the same period, Admiral Brad Cooper, the head of CENTCOM, had been pushing what's been described as a go-big strategy, essentially proposing an intensive 10 to 14-day air campaign specifically designed to cripple Iran's remaining missile and drone capabilities in one sustained push, rather than the on-and-off pattern of strikes that had defined the war up to that point, President Trump was reportedly reviewing that proposal directly, with a senior administration official describing him as being in, quote, an escalatory mood, even while continuing to weigh just how deep that response should go. Cooper's argument was straightforward. He believed the needed to significantly blunt Iran's offensive infrastructure now, arguing that destroying Tehran's missile and drone production and storage capacity would, over time, reduce how much America needed to rely on expensive defensive interceptors just to keep shooting things down reactively. But here's the pushback, and it's a serious one. General Dan Kane, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and Trump's senior military advisor, reportedly urged caution, and his reasoning wasn't emotional, it was logistical. He raised direct concerns about the United States military's dwindling supply of air defense interceptors. Think about that for a second. This is the most powerful military alliance system on the planet, and one of its most senior officers was warning the White House that continuing to intercept incoming Iranian missiles and drones at the current rate was burning through interceptor stockpiles faster than they could reasonably be replaced. Kane reportedly warned about what he called second and third order consequences, meaning that even if low interceptor inventories wouldn't stop a major combat operation outright, they would add serious risk to American forces and to regional partners if the fighting dragged on or escalated further. He's gone on record publicly saying, and I think this line is honestly one of the most important things said by anyone in this entire war, air power has its limits. That's the chairman of the Joint Chiefs telling lawmakers directly that you cannot simply bomb your way to every stated objective, especially when a lot of Iran's most sensitive facilities are buried deep underground. In some cases, deep enough that destroying them might genuinely require ground forces, something the administration has been extremely reluctant to commit to, given the risk and given ongoing questions about transparency around American casualties. And on that note, let's talk about the human cost, because it's easy to get lost in weapon systems and missile ranges and forget that people are actually dying in this conflict on both sides. CENTCOM confirmed that the American death toll from what's being called Operation Epic Fury rose to 6 service members after American forces recovered the remains of 2 personnel from a facility that had been hit during Iran's initial wave of attacks earlier in the war. CENTCOM's statement at the time was simple and heavy. Major combat operations continue. The identities of the fallen are being withheld until 24 hours after next of kin notification. President Trump, addressing the growing casualty count directly, said in a video message that it was likely additional American service members would die before this ends, and he said the country prays for the full recovery of the wounded and sends what he called immense love and eternal gratitude to the families of the fallen. That's the actual weight, sitting underneath every one of these information war claims and counterclaims. Whether or not 3 F-35s actually got destroyed at Al-Azraq, actual American lives have already been lost in this conflict, and that number keeps climbing. Now, let's get into the adversary force picture here, because understanding how Iran operates its information strategy tells you almost everything about why this F-35 claim exists at all. Iran's conventional military options have been severely degraded throughout this war. Their integrated air defense systems, the big fixed radar sites, and long-range surface-to-air missile batteries that would traditionally contest American and Allied air power have been picked apart piece by piece because those systems have one fatal flaw. They have to emit a signal to track anything, and once they emit, they can be found and destroyed. Their Navy has taken serious losses. Their ability to directly threaten American aircraft in the sky over their own territory has been dramatically reduced. So what does a state that's losing the conventional fight do? It shifts the fight into a domain where physical proof is hard to obtain, and belief matters more than fact. That's exactly what's happening here. Iran doesn't need to actually destroy 3 F-35s. Iran needs its population, its regional proxies, and honestly, a significant slice of the global online audience to believe that it destroyed 3 F-35s. Because that belief does real work. It keeps domestic morale from collapsing after months of losses. It gives regional allies, and let's be honest, proxy groups like the ones Iran has cultivated for decades, a reason to keep believing the fight is winnable. And it puts pressure, real diplomatic pressure, on the other side of the negotiating table because every claimed American loss becomes a bargaining chip in whatever quiet talks are happening behind the scenes. And this is a good moment to pause and ask you directly, because I want to know what you think about all this. If you're finding this breakdown useful, drop a like on this video. It genuinely helps push this kind of analysis to more people who are trying to actually understand what's happening in this conflict instead of just doom-scrolling headlines. And if you've got thoughts on whether you believe Iran's claim, whether you trust CENTCOM's denial completely, or whether you think the truth is somewhere messier in the middle, throw that in the comments, because some of the best context on these videos comes from people who are following this closer than I even expect. Let's keep going, because there's a global roundup worth covering here too. since this F-35 claim did not happen in isolation. It happened inside a week, absolutely packed with related developments across the region. Around the same period, the Pentagon reportedly sent out what officials described as an unusual request, essentially crowdsourcing new ideas from military personnel, regardless of rank, asking for what was termed creative and unconventional ways to pressure and punish Iran. That's not a normal move for an organization the size of the American military. When a command structure that large starts openly asking junior personnel for fresh ideas by email, it's a signal that the conventional playbook has started running dry, or at least that leadership wants to make sure they're not missing an option. General Kane's own public comments reinforce that sense of limited options, reiterating that airstrikes alone are unlikely to achieve everything the administration has stated as its objectives for this war. Meanwhile, on the diplomatic side, reports indicated that any potential deal negotiated between Tehran and intermediary states like Oman could hinge on terms the Trump administration may or may not find acceptable, and that if negotiations collapsed or Washington rejected the proposed terms, the fighting could resume immediately. Officials at the time described the situation using the phrase "quiet for quiet," meaning both sides were holding off on new attacks specifically to give diplomatic channels room to work, all while American and British officials were reportedly continuing discussions about convening an international conference to build a multinational coalition focused on protecting commercial shipping and clearing naval mines from the Strait of Hormuz, since mines left behind from months of fighting remain a persistent threat to any vessel trying to pass through that waterway, regardless of what any ceasefire says on paper. And here's a detail that connects directly back to everything we just discussed about interceptor shortages. Reports circulating around the same window suggested that American Patriot interceptor stocks had plunged by an estimated 65% since the war began, a number that, if accurate, exposes a serious vulnerability not just for American forces in the region, but potentially for Allied missile defense systems like THAAD that rely on similar interceptor logistics chains. Think about what that actually means in practice. Every single missile or drone that Iran launches, whether it's aimed at Jordan, at Israel, at a Gulf state, or directly at American assets, forces a response using increasingly scarce and increasingly expensive interceptor munitions. Iran's ballistic missiles, even the ones that get intercepted and cause zero physical damage, are still winning a quiet economic war of attrition every single time the U.S. or its allies have to spend a multi-million-dollar interceptor to stop a missile that might have cost a fraction of that to build and launch. That math is not sustainable indefinitely, and it's exactly the kind of asymmetric pressure that a militarily degraded but strategically patient adversary can keep applying for a very long time. Let's actually slow down for a second and talk about why the F-35 is so genuinely difficult to hit in the first place, because that context makes Iran's claim even more extraordinary if you think it through properly. The F-35 wasn't designed against Iran specifically, but almost every survivability decision baked into that airframe traces directly back to the exact family of threats Iran has spent 2 decades buying from Russia and China. Start with the jet's low observable shaping and radar absorbent coating, which dramatically shrinks its radar cross-section against exactly the kind of Russian-derived early warning and fire control radars Iran has fielded for years. Layer on top of that, the AN/AAQ-37 distributed aperture system, a network of high-resolution infrared sensors mounted around the airframe, giving the pilot full spherical coverage with no blind spots, capable of detecting a missile launch, tracking it, computing its point of origin, and cueing countermeasures automatically, all without the pilot even having to look in the right direction. Add the AN/ASQ-239 electronic warfare suite from BAE Systems, providing 360-degree radar warning and jamming capability built specifically for a dense, contested signal environment. This is not a jet that just happens to survive by luck. Every layer of it was engineered assuming it would one day face exactly the kind of integrated air defense network Iran spent 20 years assembling. So when Iran claims a ballistic missile, a weapon with comparatively poor terminal accuracy against a specific point target, managed to destroy 3 of these aircraft, while they were presumably sitting inside hardened maintenance shelters designed specifically to protect against blast and shrapnel. That claim is asking you to believe a lot of things went wrong for the American side simultaneously. It's not impossible. Hardened shelters are not indestructible, and a direct or near-direct hit from a large enough warhead absolutely can penetrate and destroy whatever is inside. But the burden of proof for a claim that's specific and that damaging should be correspondingly high, and right now that proof simply does not exist in a form any independent analyst has been able to verify. It's also worth remembering that the Qeshm Island strike that Iran used to justify this entire retaliatory narrative is itself sitting in that same fog. Iran says the American strike hit 2 residential homes and injured civilians. CENTCOM's own characterization framed its operations there as strikes against IRGC-related targets, not against private residences. Qeshm Island itself is not just some random patch of Iranian coastline. It sits directly at the mouth of the Strait of Hormuz, and it has long been suspected by Western intelligence of hosting IRGC naval and fast attack boat infrastructure used to harass and board commercial shipping throughout this conflict. So even the triggering event for this entire chain, the thing Iran says it was avenging, is itself a contested claim sitting on top of another contested claim. It's disputed narratives stacked on disputed narratives. And by the time you get to 3 destroyed F-35s at the very end of that chain, you're several layers removed from anything either side can definitively prove. Let's shift briefly to what's happening elsewhere in the region that ties back into this exact same dynamic of contested narratives and asymmetric pressure. Reports throughout this period also referenced ongoing Iranian drone operations targeting what were described as Kurdish separatist group facilities inside Iraqi Kurdistan, near Erbil and Sulaymaniyah, with Iranian state media publishing footage claiming successful strikes on multiple warehouses and a headquarters building. Whether or not every claimed target was hit exactly as described follows the exact same pattern we've been discussing this entire video. Iranian state media publishes a confident claim with supporting footage and independent verification lags far behind the claim itself, if it arrives at all. This is simply how Iran fights the parts of this war it cannot win conventionally. Claim first, verify never, and let the footage do the talking, even when the footage is ambiguous. There's another thread worth pulling on here too, because it explains a lot about why Iran chose Al-Azraq specifically, rather than making this same claim about a base somewhere else. Muwaffaq Salti has been a recurring flashpoint throughout this entire war, hosting American and coalition aircraft that have flown a significant share of the sorties over Iranian airspace during Operation Epic Fury. It's close enough to Iran to be operationally relevant and far enough inside a partner nation's territory that any successful strike on it would represent a genuine escalation, since it means Iran is directly targeting facilities on the soil of a third country, rather than trading fire with the United States and Israel alone. Jordan has walked an incredibly careful line throughout this conflict, hosting American assets while trying to avoid becoming a full frontline state in a war that isn't technically theirs. Every Iranian missile fired at that kingdom, intercepted or not, tests that balance a little further, and every claim of a successful strike on American jets sitting on Jordanian soil is Iran trying to send a message not just to Washington, but to Amman as well, a message that says hosting American air power carries a cost. And that cost is going to keep escalating the longer the war continues. Now let's get to the part of this story that I think deserves the most attention, because it's the connection almost nobody watching the headlines is actually making. This entire F-35 claim isn't really about 3 aircraft in Jordan. It's about a fundamental shift in how Iran is fighting this war at this specific stage of the conflict. Early on, and we've talked about this in other breakdowns, Iran fought for altitude. They fought with fixed radar sites, with long-range surface-to-air missile batteries, with an integrated air defense network they'd spent 2 decades building around Russian and Chinese architecture. That fight is essentially over, and Iran lost it because every one of those systems has to sit still and emit a signal to function. And American and Allied suppression campaigns systematically dismantled that entire structure piece by piece. So Iran adapted. It moved toward proxy tactics, toward drones, toward shoulder-fired missiles that don't require a data link or a radar emission that can be traced back to a launch point. And now, with this F-35 claim, you're watching Iran adapt again, this time into the information domain itself, because if you cannot contest American air power physically anymore, the next best thing is to contest it narratively. Make the world doubt whether American stealth technology is really as untouchable as it's been sold to be. Make your own population believe you're still winning, even while your conventional military capability keeps shrinking month over month. And here's the part that ties it all together with the interceptor shortage numbers we just covered. Even a completely false claim of destroying 3 F-35s serves Iran's strategic interest, because it forces the American side to spend time, energy, and public relations, capital issuing formal denials, drafting statements, releasing counter-evidence, all of which distracts from and slows down whatever escalatory military planning is happening behind closed doors, like that 10 to 14-day air campaign Admiral Cooper was reportedly pushing for. Every day CENTCOM spends responding to information warfare is a day not spent finalizing the next physical strike package. That's not necessarily a coordinated Iranian master plan. It might just be a fortunate byproduct for Tehran, but the effect is the same either way. Confusion, delay, and a global audience left genuinely unsure of what actually happened at a military base in the Jordanian desert on a Thursday morning in late July. There's also a domestic political angle to this that's easy to overlook if you're only watching the military side of the story. Inside Iran, morale management has become almost as important a battlefield as anything happening in the Strait of Hormuz. Months of strikes have degraded the country's air defenses, damaged its navy, and reportedly killed or wounded a significant number of IRGC personnel across multiple provinces, including the 3 members the Guards said were killed in Zanjan province around this same period, described in their own statement as having attained martyrdom in what they called a brutal attack by the United States. When a government is absorbing losses like that on a regular basis, it needs periodic, dramatic wins to hand its population, something concrete to point to that says the fight is still winnable and the sacrifice is still worth it. 3 destroyed F-35s is exactly that kind of win, tailor-made for state media, tailor-made for rallying domestic support, and largely irrelevant to whether it can survive independent scrutiny. Because by the time any fact check catches up, the story has already done its job inside Iran's own information ecosystem. So where does this actually leave us? CENTCOM says nothing was destroyed. Iran says 3 F-35s are gone and 3 more are crippled. Jordan confirms missiles were fired and intercepted, but has not confirmed Iran's specific damage claims about the American aircraft. Satellite imagery exists, but remains too low resolution to settle the argument either way. And underneath all of it, the war grinds forward, with American service members continuing to die, with interceptor stockpiles continuing to shrink, with military leadership publicly debating whether air power alone can even finish what this conflict set out to do. That is the real story here, not whether 3 specific airframes are sitting in a hangar in Jordan right now or scattered across a runway in pieces. The real story is a militarily weakened Iran that has figured out it doesn't need to win the battlefield anymore. It just needs to win enough of the narrative to keep the fight alive, keep its population believing, and keep enough doubt in the air that every single American claim gets automatically challenged before it's even finished being made. So I want to know what you actually think happened here. Do you believe CENTCOM's flat denial completely? Do you think there's a real chance some damage occurred even if the scale is exaggerated? Or do you think this is pure information warfare with almost nothing behind it? Drop your take in the comments. I read every single one. And honestly, some of the sharpest analysis on these videos comes directly from people watching this conflict closer than most news outlets are. And if you want to stay ahead of where this goes next, because there is very clearly more coming, given everything we just covered about escalation plans sitting on the president's desk, go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss the next breakdown the moment new developments drop. Share this with anyone you know who's been asking what's actually going on with Iran and the F-35 story, because there is a lot of noise out there right now and not a lot of people actually walking through the full picture like we just did. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.